Welcome to the Toronto Real Estate Podcast. Today, we are going to look at the 8 most important factors to be looking at or leading indicators that we will be tracking, that we will be looking at throughout the year, talking about with our clients, and actually discussing on this channel as to better understand where the market is and, more importantly, where it's going. So we have these 8 key leading indicators that we track, and we wanted to share that with you so that as you are, if you're watching this channel, obviously you're interested or active in the Toronto real estate market. So these are the key things that we feel that you should be looking at to understand where we're at and where the market is going in the future. My name is Ralph Fox. I am the co-founder and broker of record of Fox Marin Associates. Today we have my partner in crime, Kori Marin, who is a broker and co-founder as well at Fox Marin, here to join us to break it all down for everyone, for all of our viewers. So without further ado, Kori, great to have you here, and let's get into it.
Well, I'm looking forward to this topic, and I was laughing before we commenced the podcast recording today as we approach this very topic because, Ralph, you've got such great business instincts. This is the wheelhouse that you live in. So it reminds me very much when we go meet a new selling client, I will often go in with like heaps of information, everything printed out and all the analysis done in advance. Everything is calculated. And you're like, Core, it will be fine. Let's just go with our guts. I'm like, no, I don't have a gut. Or if I do, I don't know how to listen to it. So I think this is a perfect way for us to bridge our 2 different business personality styles.
Exactly. So if you're wondering, this is a window into our lives and our creative and business process. Kori,
Yes.
Why don't you lead, being the opener that you are, and talk to us about leading indicator number 1.
Perfect. Well, obviously, interest rates are going to be a huge leading indicator, and they certainly have influenced the market over the last 2 or 3 years big time. So we are going to be closely monitoring them. Obviously, if you're attuned to the Toronto real estate market or the Canadian economy in general, you know that the Bank of Canada has been reducing rates. Thank God. And as of December 2024, the Bank of Canada reduced the policy interest rates by 50 basis points to 3.25%. And this is really to counteract a weaker economy and really help adjust for our softening labor market. And let's talk about the fixed rate versus the variable and how that might shift as we move into the first quarter of the year.
Yeah. So one thing, you were on a roll there, but for the sake of clarity, the Bank of Canada, aka the BOC, they directly impact the variable rate. The fixed rate is impacted more directly by the bond market, which is an entirely different animal. And so one necessarily does not impact the other. So when we talk about interest rates, it's just important to understand that while we're focused so much on what the Bank of Canada is doing, it really is important to know that its direct effect is on the variable, and also its commentary very much sets the tone for what markets and businesses can be expecting in the future. A lot of people read into these probably a little bit more than they should, but it's just an important thing to note. The thing to really understand, and it shouldn't come surprise to anybody, is that real estate, residential real estate, is hypersensitive to interest rates and where interest rates are at. And that is why we have been in such a low interest rate environment prior to 2022. That is why we saw that strong run up in prices, because the cost to borrow, it was basically free money for a number of years. And so we saw a dramatic shift in interest rates as inflation started to tick in 2022 as a result of all the money that the government was literally just shoving into the economy during COVID. It had a real inflationary impact. And so the greatest lever that banks typically have, central banks have to fight inflation, is interest rates. And they raise interest rates with the hope of bringing inflation down by cooling off or contracting the economy, which it appears that they've done. Interest or inflation seems to be under control now. We're under the mark of 2%. We're at about 1.9%. The Bank of Canada's target being 2 to 3%. So, and I could speak for ever about how they calculate it and how I think these numbers are very misguided as indicators. But without going too deep into the weeds, inflation seems to be under control. And the bigger concern now, if you listen to what the Bank of Canada is saying, is unemployment and potentially even deflation. And that's why we're seeing a lot of projections by the big six banks in Canada expecting a lot more reductions over the course of the year. Now, what's interesting is that they've all been wrong before in the past. I've looked at these numbers in 2022 where we had that massive ramp up, and a chart like this was showing, all the banks on average were projecting maybe 25 or 50 basis points. And instead, we got 300 or something that year. So it's important to take all of this with a grain of salt. But I do agree that the variable the Bank of Canada is going to keep cutting. I think we're going to see even lower than these projections. I think the economy is doing a little worse than most people understand or taking into account. And I think we could land at the end of next year at around 2%. But this is a really important indicator to follow. It feeds upon sentiment and confidence in the market, and it really is the greatest driver of demand when you're talking about a multi-million-dollar asset and you're acquiring it with less than 20% down. There's a lot of leverage in the system, and because of that leverage, we are very, very sensitive to interest rates, and more so than in the US, where our typical mortgage doesn't go past 5-year terms, where in the US they go up to 30. So we're much more sensitive to these increases, especially as time goes on. It can really, really affect the economy and sentiment in the marketplace.
So I have a couple of questions. We did
Mhm.
see some drastic interest rate cuts over 2024, which were much needed.
Mhm.
It's not like all of a sudden we saw a run up in buyers coming out from the sidelines being like, okay, interest rates are coming down. I want to purchase now. Where was the lack of enthusiasm in terms of acquiring properties with lower rates as the year went on in 2024?
I think that's a great question. I think uncertainty, political uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, macro uncertainty, uncertainty here in our political environment, job uncertainty. I think the uncertainty and the already elevated prices of real estate in the city have caused a lot of pause up until now. But I think there will be a point where money will become very enticing, and it will bring a lot of those buyers off the sidelines into the market. And I think eventually we'll start to see that in the condo market, which has been suffering and probably has some more suffering to go.
Yeah.
The low rise market, which has been doing okay, even at these higher interest rates above the average that we've seen over the last 10 years.
I definitely agree that uncertainty was highly influential in terms of buyer sentiment in 2024.
Mhm.
And I do think that we'll continue to see some of that uncertainty and that pattern of behavior as we move through the first 2 quarters of this year. And I don't really think that big ship is going to start turning around psychologically for a little while still. So I think that there's going to be some ebbs and flows for us to get over first, even if we see further reductions in the rate in the coming months. And then my other question about this is, and we've had a lot of our buyers ask, and I'd love for you to provide your input here, and also acknowledging that you're not a mortgage specialist,
Oh
Ralph.
God, no. I could never
Um,
do that.
but the difference between the variable and the fixed right now, like if you were up for renewal and you had to choose between the two, and I know that you and I have been in that situation, which direction would you go and why?
Yeah, without question. Again, this is not to be deemed as financial advice
Of
because I am
course.
not a mortgage broker and not necessarily qualified. But I'll speak to what we would do and what we are doing. We're definitely going variable. We're going to ride the variable down. And it's been an extreme situation over the last year and a half or a couple of years. But typically, if you look at like 100-year charts, or whatever, as ever far back as the charts go, 90% of the time, variables do outperform fixed mortgages. So we've just gone through an extreme period, and I think the counter extreme to that will be a significant drop. And so I definitely would look to see the variable come down more aggressively than the fixed, which is tied to a lot of other economic indicators, which I think is going to remain stubborn in terms of the movement downwards that we'll see.
And not to quiz you on this question because I can look it up. Do you know when the next interest rate announcement is?
January 29th.
Oh, so it's coming up.
Yeah. And interestingly, I believe it's on the same day as the Fed, the US central bank's announcement.
Okay.
It will be
And
interesting to see.
what's your prediction?
We might see a quarter,
Okay.
but who knows?
Okay. So speaking to that, let's move on to point number 2, the
Mhm.
overall economy. Let's talk about unemployment. Let's talk about the stock market. And let's just talk about the psychology or overall sentiment of Canadians and Torontonians when it comes to the Canadian economy. Where are we sitting right now? So in December of 2024, so just last month, Canada's economy added 90,000 jobs, which I believe a lot of those were government jobs. According to the research that I did, that surpassed the forecast, leading to a decrease in the overall national unemployment rate to 6.7%. And the unemployment rate in Canada averages about 7.54% between 1966 up until 2024. And it's reached an all-time high, which makes total sense, of 13.7% in 2020. We know why. COVID in the spring in May 2020 was at its all-time high, and it reached its record low of 2.9% in June of 1966, way back then. So despite this growth, certain demographics, the youth segment and newcomers are really suffering when it comes to unemployment. And the unemployment rate in Toronto itself was 8.4%, so higher than the national average over the last 50 plus years. And it was actually up 0.3% versus the previous month. So talk to me a little bit more about this, and why is it important for our viewers to be monitoring the unemployment rate, both in Toronto and nationally as well, when it comes to real estate?
I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on versus what the government and the powers that be want us to think versus what is actually happening. And I think that is why so many people have been taken off guard by the amount of reductions that we've seen. So yeah, it sounds great that we had 90,000 new jobs, but when 45% of our entire populace is employed by the government, you start to wonder, are we a central economy, a socialist economy, or are we a capitalist and free market economy? And so when you start to wonder where all the jobs are going, and is the private sector being basically destroyed by policy and regulation, you start to see that play out, and you do a little deeper digging into the numbers, and they're not the way they appear. If you look at GDP, which is what the government wants us to look at, it has been masked over by all of the immigration that we've had coming here. But yet at the same time, if you look at GDP per capita, we've been down for 7 or 8 quarters now, back to back, meaning on an individual basis, we are getting poorer and poorer. And when you look at the metrics and you start to realize there are at least 1.5 million Canadians who are unemployed. And a few months ago, I think there were 2 million Canadians at food banks. You start to realize that the economy is really becoming a situation of the haves and the have-nots. And you have a lot of people in that lower middle class, lower class range that I think are really hurting. Real estate is remaining buoyant because assets are continuing to inflate. And so you have the upper middle class and the upper class seemingly having their asset values increase. So I think that there's a misnomer that everything is just fine. I think the bank is reacting accordingly. And I think as a result, the situation is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But I think things to be thinking about when you're thinking about the economy, and again, this might be seemingly contrarian to a lot of people, but I view the United States right now as their economy as a giant spring coil that is literally going to explode. And I don't want to necessarily go into why I think or believe that, but when the US economy takes off, if their GDP hits 3.5%, 4%, which I think it could, there will be a dramatic pull. So I think what happens on Canada, so I think what happens in the US economically will directly impact what happens here. And as you know, we have potentially an upcoming election here. And I think if there is change, and that change is that we want to move in tandem as a free market capitalist society with some of the changes that are happening in the US, and potentially open up some of the natural resources, that we have under the ground, it could dramatically shape the economic landscape. And a year from now, a year and a half from now, our economy could be in a lot different, a lot better circumstances than it presently finds itself. If I just read in the US right now that their small business confidence index is at the highest level it's been since 1982. We're not feeling that here as small business operators in Canada, but I think it could change, and I think there are some big catalysts that could impact that. So it's a real important indicator to watch. Things seem very shaky and are probably a little bit worse structurally than people understand, or that's being reported in the news. But I think that there is hope, and I think that there is possibility for a lot of change. So that could have a positive impact. And if that change doesn't happen, that could have a huge drag on market sentiment and market realities in Toronto.
I was reading about the forecasts coming out of CIBC and BMO about where they see the projections for the Toronto Stock Exchange, Toronto stock market moving towards through 2025. And I was really surprised to see that CIBC is projecting an 11% increase in the S&P. I was like, I found that to be very surprising. And they were leaning into the idea of this as being a response to monetary easing.
Yes.
And then also the BMO strategists said that we often trail the US markets, but we feel that we might be able to outperform the S&P 500 by up to 200 basis points in Canadian dollars, of course, in 2025, which I also found very interesting.
I think that some of the thought process behind it is not just when you say monetary easing, but increasing the M2 monetary supply, which will further drive asset prices. It seemed to be inflationary as well. But I think if we get to a point where they start to open up the taps again, not as strong as they did at COVID, but I think we'll see a big stimulus response coming from the Bank of Canada to help revive our economy. And again, that will just drive asset prices higher for those that actually own assets. But I think the average Canadian has a way to go before we start to see a turnaround in GDP per capita. And I think that'll really have to start with opening up a lot of regulations, both on small business and taxation and the natural resources that we're just seemingly not allowed to touch and have to import from the rest of the world.
I did get my carbon tax rebate today.
Oh, you did? I don't think I've ever gotten one.
I did get it. I saw a reel about it that it should be in our account. So I specifically went over there to see if it actually was there, and it was.
Well, every time.
$210.
Well, I can tell you, with our cottage property, we pay every 2 months, just for the use of propane, $90 approximately, and then we pay HST on top of the government tax. So we are actually double taxed. And I can tell you from our perspective, we are not breaking even or even close to it. It is not a wash. And it's set to
more money in Canadian families' pockets, Ralph.
Apparently. Well, it's set to triple. So I guess we're going to get richer in April unless there's a change of government.
Let's talk about another key indicator that's really important for our viewers to look at. We've talked about this in former podcasts. I really, really want real estate people and lovers to pay attention to these numbers. Months of inventory, then we're going to talk about days on market. So basically, months of inventory is how much product is out there for buyers to acquire in the marketplace, and how long would it take for the market for buyers to absorb that inventory over time. So this is just one way for us to take a look at the amount of supply and demand we have in terms of how much this inventory is moving through the system. This is a way for us to measure if we're in a buyer's market or a seller's market or a balanced market. So this is something you're going to hear a lot about, and it's a really important number for you to become very familiar with. And if you're looking to buy or sell, I really want you to be having conversations about inventory with your agent or broker of choice, because this highly impacts the outcome of your particular asset. And I know people get annoyed when we call homes assets, but in this particular case, we're just trying to generalize condos, semi-detached, multiplexes, everything clumped in together as an asset because it is one. Okay. And for some people, they're homes, and for some people, they're investments. So let's talk about this. So in Toronto right now, I just pulled the December 2024 inventory numbers. For all properties combined, we actually have 5.3 months of supply. That's a lot of inventory. Rough. Like, I was actually surprised to pull that number. Now, let's be very transparent here that December is a very slow month seasonally. People are distracted by Christmas. People aren't necessarily shopping for the next condo or house during that month. But we've also seen some very busy Decembers in the past as well. So to see 5.3 months of supply with everything combined, I thought was very high. The freehold market, so your low rise market, is 3.6 months of supply, so much less. And then the condo segment, which Ralph briefly addressed, has been struggling more so than the freehold asset class, is almost at 7 months of supply as of December 2024. So we have a ton of condo inventory sitting out there.
I think the most important thing is to understand the difference between the condo market and the freehold. They've completely separated. And the freehold, meaning semi-detached, detached, it has done as an asset class very well through this high interest rate environment. Condos, however, has really, really suffered. And so that's where we're seeing that great discrepancy between the two. But this is a great leading indicator. And if you track it month over month, it's a very quick way to understand how the market is performing and where things are going over the short term. Again, the more supply that we have, the more pressure there will be on pricing. Supply and demand drives all markets. Real estate is no exception to that. And so when you start to understand the rate of sales and what's on the market and how long it's taking properties to sell, it gives you an indication of at least where things are and could be moving for the short term. So it's something we talk about all the time on this podcast. It's something we talk about with all of our clients, and our entire team monitors this religiously because it's the best way to get a high level as to how the market is performing and where it could be heading over the short term.
I will toss this up on the screen too for the viewers if you want to see the 5-year history of Decembers from 2020 up until now. So on the graph that we're just about to post here, you can see how much inventory has increased since 2020 in this particular month. And you can see in December 2021, we had 0.8 months of supply. And that has been increasing year over year significantly. I mean, last year at this time, we had about 3.5 months of supply. So like Ralph said, we really want you to be monitoring these numbers. And when you're looking at selling your property, you want to make sure that you are priced aligned with your expectations, but you're also comparing where you sit in the market with everything else that is out there as well. And then on another podcast, we can talk about this, but you really want to make sure that you stand out in the crowd, and we can talk about how we do that at another time. Another indicator in this particular segment we want to talk about is days on market. So how long does it take for your home to sell? Now, just to be clear, we're talking about listing days on market here. When we've pulled these stats today, all properties combined, it's taking about 37 days for properties to sell. That's condos and freeholds combined. But there isn't a significant difference between the two. Condos are taking on average 39 days to sell, and that's not always indicated. It's not indicative of when they've been relisted. So they've been like listed, terminated, and relisted. This is not indicated of that strategy. And freeholds are taking on average 37 days to sell. I also want the viewers to be clear, this is inclusive of any conditions in the offer as well. So if the purchaser has put in conditions of financing or home inspection or appraisal or whatever it might be, these listing days on market are inclusive of that time. But I mean, this is a lot longer than Ralph, myself, and the team and a lot of Toronto agents are acclimatized to working in these slower timelines. You know, we were very used to at a particular time for listings, quality listings, to be selling in 2 hours or 24 hours or maybe like 5 whole days. So this is a lot slower market conditions for buyers out there that are actually shopping for properties right now. you have a lot of time to make decisions, to really do your research, to educate yourself, to look at a lot of inventory and repeat a visit, go back to the property 2 or 3 times and do your due diligence. Time is on your side. And we haven't always seen that in this marketplace here in Toronto.
Awesome. Okay, so let's move on to indicator number 4. We're going to talk about the rental market and vacancy rates. We're definitely seeing a softening in the rental market. I think anecdotally speaking, a lot more people are staying or choosing to stay at home and or to stay put. So we're seeing less turnover, and then we have a lot of those COVID special rent controlled deals that people got, and they're hunkered in. And so we're seeing not a lot of people turning over, but we are seeing a lot of influx of supply, especially in new condos coming. I think there's over the next 2 years, maybe 100 some odd thousand condo units coming to market, the majority of which will become rentals. And so we have a lot of, especially on the condo side, we have a lot of rental inventory. We've got a lot of purpose-built rentals, which are really, really struggling. So there's a lot of rental inventory that's out there. We've got a lot of people who are hunkered down. There's still demand, but the demand is becoming muted, especially with a lot of the economic uncertainty that we're experiencing right now. And so because of that, we're seeing it play out where we're seeing a slowdown in the rental market. And I think vacancy rates are somewhere around 2.5%, which by Toronto standards is very, very high. Like I'm much more used to seeing it sub, 1% or in the low 1% range. So there's a lot of pressure, and I think we're going to see the market really struggle on the rental side. I think it's going to hurt landlords, at least for the short term. Long term, I'm far less concerned because after this big wave of new product comes online, there's nothing in the pipeline because pre-construction sales have just literally died off over the last 2 to 3 years. So this is the last push, but I do think keeping your eye on vacancy rates and in turn understanding the pressure that could be put on landlords with sitting empty properties could then affect the condo market, especially those smaller, more investor type units. So keep your eye on vacancy rates. I think it's going to continue to play out, especially over this year, and definitely impact the larger condo market for sure.
I don't think it would be a bad thing to see a little cooling off on the rental rates either while we see some of this inventory and these vacancies get filled, because affordability is 100% a problem. And the rates sometimes on rentals, you're just like, how is any person at a university expected to ever pay this and live and go to the club all at the same time?
What about bottle service?
I know everyone has bottle service these days.
I never had.
I don't think I've still had bottle service.
I lived in a basement. I never had bottle service.
I still have never had bottle service, and I don't really want to try now to attempt to see what that would be like, but I don't think I've ever had it. Okay. Let's talk about, are we moving on, Ralph, to point 5?
Yep.
Indicator?
Yep.
Let's talk about the low rise market. I think we really should dive into this. I think this is a huge leading indicator. I want our viewers to pay close attention to number 5 in the price points between 1.2 million and 1.4 million, particularly in the semi-detached category. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how that might affect the 2-bedroom condo sector. A couple things here, Ralph, before we get your insights on this. I just want to talk about what the semi-detached home price was in the 416 in December. So the average semi is about $1.3 million in the 416, and prices in this category were actually up almost 11% versus last year at this time. So already, before we even kicked off 2025 officially, this category is already very enticing, very competitive, and something we want you to be paying attention to. And we'll talk about why that might affect the 2-bedroom condo sector.
So it's interesting that you highlighted this because on December 15th, the Liberal government bought in a policy whereby the CMHC, if you are putting down less than 20%, you were capped at a lesser down payment. So if you're putting less than 5, 10, 15% down, the most mortgage you'll qualify for is $1 million. They've increased that cap to 1.5 effective December 15th. And they also reduced the increased the amortization from 25 to 30. And I still remember Christina Freeland, who now wants to become our prime minister, stood up in the House and said that this would help affordability and that in turn it would open up supply somehow. So in fact, it's done the opposite, and it's driven up first-time buyer price category significantly. And this is only 15 days into this brand new policy. And what's interesting is that the people who can afford 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 on an uninsured mortgage, meaning less than 20% down, the interest is very high. So they're high earning income, probably families or couples with no down payment. So it's not a huge amount of population that you're opening up this price point to. But what is relevant is if you add another 100 qualified buyers to this pool, you can see how little the sales are in downtown, like 113 sales. So of course it ignited this price category. And I think this is going to continue to be, for the short term, a very, very hot category of property in central and downtown Toronto. And that in turn could start to force a lot of buyers into the condo market, specifically the larger 2-bedroom, 2+ den, who just can't compete at $1 million anymore, and for just pure affordability reasons. So I'd really watch the semi-detached properties at this price range of 1.2 to 1.4. And as this becomes out of range, this could have a very big impact on the condo market, specifically not the investor side, which are the smaller 1-bedroom studios, 1+ dens, but the 2, 3 larger 1,000+ 900 square foot condos could really start to take off as this becomes out of reach for most buyers.
100%. And for the viewers out there, your 2-bedroom or your 2+1, which means a den in addition to your bedrooms, in the condo sector, hover just under $1 million or just over $1 million, depending, of course, on the building, the square footage, the amenities, the age, parking, locker, terrace, so on and so forth. So I think it can still be a palatable price point for people who want to acquire a property but just can't move or compete in that 1.2 to 1.4 range. If you are considering a condo versus a semi-detached right now, I mean, there is a lot of amazing older buildings built in the 80s and the 90s in downtown Toronto in great areas with exceptional floor plans that we'd highly recommend you take a look at. Yes, they look ugly right now, but you could do a lipstick renovation on those and just make these stunning properties exceptional for you and your family.
Yep.
I want to add to that, though, please do pay attention to the maintenance fees and how the building is run and managed, and the reserve fund and the status certificate, which we could talk about in another podcast, and we could talk about this for hours. But there is a really good opportunity for young families who need to acquire size and scale and not live in a cookie cutter condo in the middle of no man's land. There are properties out there that could really accommodate a family with a lot of square footage and tons of valuable and walkable neighborhoods. Anything else you want to add to this, Ralph?
No, I think you did a great job putting this together, Kori.
Oh, amazing. All right, well, let's talk about something kind of fun. Number 6, the incoming U.S. administration.
Okay.
It's happening.
So I think it's just really important to see how this plays out. There's a lot of tariff talks. There's a lot of friction right now between the US. Their president is right now trolling Canada. I don't know where our prime minister is. I know he's set to resign. So we've got some of our provincial leaders standing up for Canada. So the whole thing seems to be a little chaotic. But I think when you remove the noise, I think it's a lot of bluster. We'll see how this plays out. Maybe there will be 25% tariffs across the board. That will definitely affect things. But again, not getting into predictions, but I do think that this is just a negotiating tactic already. Canada's putting $1 billion onto our border, and now we got helicopters suddenly patrolling our border. Seems like a good idea. I don't know. But just seeing how all of this plays out, because so much trade goes back and forth between Canada and the US. If there is some type of a favorable outcome and resolution to this in the first half of the year, I think that will be very bullish for our economy. And so watching all of this play out will be a very important leading indicator to see how our market and the broader markets will respond. And so really watching what happens between Canada and the US and how all of this friction plays out will be a very important indicator over the next few months to track, because it has an option to go really, really well or awfully wrong. And so let's see how it plays out, but keep your eye on this, because I think this is really going to be important.
I do think, though, already there are some positives coming out of this. So, one is, Ralph, you mentioned this. You felt that the US economy is a spring and it's just about to take off. And I do think that that will highly influence Canada here, which is great. But I actually really like the fact that we are now, because of the US, paying attention to some things that are meaningful to me personally and to a lot of people that we know. I love the new revised border security and people looking at that and the fact we're paying attention to it. We're looking at our immigration processing, which I think is long overdue and it has to happen. And I like the fact that people are talking about cracking down on crime more. And this has highly been influenced by the US elections. And now people are talking about it here. And it's long overdue. And I'm glad it's happening. I will be paying very close attention to this. I'm finding this drama to be very infatuating, to be honest. And I really hope that it only causes positive outcomes for us here in Canada. We really deserve it. We've had a rough couple years, maybe like 9 or so. And it'd be really nice to see a change here. Really, really, really needed.
And speaking of change, that is indicator number 7, Canadian elections. Maybe there should be a question mark beside that.
Yes.
It seems like there's an election coming, but we've seen a lot of politicians backtrack on a lot of their words lately. But it looks like we could have a new leader of the Liberal Party and potential prime minister. By mid-March? I think it's like March 6th or March 9th. And then, once the NDP leader gets his pension fund, theoretically, he's indicated that he would now be ready to call an election and support a non-confidence motion. So we'll see how all this plays out. But I think understanding how important this is and which direction things go will be very important to the economy, to the markets, to overall sentiment. It'll be something really, really, really important. I think the vast majority of Canadians want change. And I think the change that could happen could really help open up relations between Canada and the US, which is so important. And I think it could really open up our economy and have implications on a lower tax environment, lower regulation environment, and a little bit less ideological and common sense approach to meeting challenges.
And I think some of these key things we want to be looking out for is cutting this carbon tax, which is complete bullshit. The slashing of GST on new homes, that will be highly influential on the housing market. Definitely, as you mentioned, Ralph, deregulating a lot of the development issues that we have across the board in Canada and how slow and sluggish the process is to develop properties, condominiums, and communities. I think it's ridiculous and expensive. And I really am looking forward to seeing some of this crackdown on freaking crime. It's just out of control. And I'd like to see some of these changes happen really quickly.
And last but not least, but very much in tandem with the election, is changes in policy. We've seen so many attempts at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the federal level to help bring in affordability. In actuality, most have been very hurtful to affordability, as they've been more focused on demand side solutions versus supply side, which is where it's really needed, especially with, and this has been a bit of a hot button topic as of late, for good reason and rightly so, but all these excessive development charges where you have $300,000 on $1 million condo brand new going to taxes, and they wonder why real estate is so expensive. And so I think we really just need to watch what happens in terms of further policy initiatives. Like we spoke earlier about the changes to CMHC lending, which again, as I was supposed to open up supply, but all it did was it sparked greater demand, and it really has pushed affordability even further out of reach for most. So that's just one example. But I think looking at like all the policies and proposals coming online and what effect that could have on the market, especially after this elections, which hopefully happens in the spring, and seeing some of the plans that new leadership looks to bring in. There could be a provincial election upcoming as well. I know the Liberal nominee or head of the Liberal provincial party, she's got some very aggressive ideas. And so it'll be really interesting to see how some of these policies come in and how they could affect plus or minus the market.
Yep. I think that one thing that I'm going to definitely be paying attention to, and Ralph, I know you will as well, is the change in sentiment around immigration policy. And I think there's pros and cons to that. I definitely think that we need to look at the way we are attracting new people to the country and the skilled immigration in filling in the labor market in particular sectors like construction is much needed and 100% healthcare. But I think we just brought too many people in too soon and too fast. And we just did not have, and this really affected big markets like Toronto and Vancouver. We just did not having the housing to accommodate. And I think we're paying the price for that, or the infrastructure for that matter. I'd like to say that all of this is positive. I think right now a lot of it's just a known unknown.
Exactly. And there's a lot of policy like immigration, which directly isn't tied like CMHC lending to real estate, but definitely has an impact on it. And so it'll be really interesting to watch a lot of the policy promises that get made both at the federal level and provincial level, knowing that probably the number one issue or number two issue, top three anyways, is affordability and housing, and seeing how these candidates and parties propose to tackle these issues. And again, like if you're just thinking critically, is it going to open up more supply, which we so desperately will need 2 years, 3 years from now? Or is it going to tighten supply and increase demand? And if it's the latter, it will have an inflationary aspect to pricing, and it will further push further push affordability out of reach for the average Canadian.
Yeah, which is already so crazy.
Exactly. So there you have it. These are our 8 key leading indicators to keep your eye on to understand what's happening in the market, and more importantly, where it's going, at least on the short term. Hopefully, you've tuned in and found this conversation helpful to set you up for success in 2025. Thank you so much for joining us, Kori. So great to have you here. Please be sure to hit that like or subscribe button. If you have any commentary, please be sure to comment down below, as we would absolutely love to hear from you.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, everybody.